You see it all the time. What I'll call doubling down on wrong in hopes that the mess will simply go away. Perhaps it starts with that simple, "Who did this? Not me," dialogue that pretty much every parent is familiar with, right? I mean, even if the evidence is right there, kids still try denials and half-truths and outright lies, anything to avoid responsibility for the mess, and anything to avoid responsibility for cleaning it up. Now, as you grow older, people just seem to get better at it, right? Bigger and more practiced lies, bigger and more practiced denials, bigger and more practiced stories and emotionally charged counter-accusations repeated so often and so loudly that other people begin to accept them as truth. It's a pretty consistent pattern. One lie or one wrong act, and then when you're caught or confronted about that, another one to cover it up, and another one to cover that up, and another one to cover that up, and so on and so on and so on, almost if you think you can come full circle so that at least in your own mind, and hopefully in a lot of other people's minds, that lie is suddenly seen as truth, and the wrong suddenly seen as right. And the methods are conveniently forgotten, and the consequences are manageable and minimal, if there even end up being any consequences at all. And the more successful that you are at that spin, the more you're able to postpone having to own up to your own actions and face any unpleasant consequences, the more you're able to actually convince yourself that doubling down on wrong was a good and effective strategy. Well, it's not. It's not. For a lot of reasons, including that the mess is still a mess until it's cleaned up, which means, and here's a phrase worth remembering, doubling down on wrong doesn't make it right. Doubling down on wrong doesn't make it right. To help us see that, we're going to look at the story of what I'll call Jacob's big lie. It's in Genesis chapter 27. Listen.
One day when Isaac was old and turning blind, he called for Esau, his older son, and said, "My son?" "Yes, father," Esau replied. "I'm an old man now," Isaac said, "and I don't know when I may die. Take your bow and a quiver full of arrows and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare my favorite dish and bring it here for me to eat. Then I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die." But Rebekah overheard what Isaac had said to his son Esau. So when Esau left to hunt for the wild game, she said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I overheard your father say to Esau, 'Bring me some wild game and prepare me a delicious meal. Then I will bless you in the Lord's presence before I die. Now my son, listen to me, do exactly as I tell you. Go out to the flocks and bring me 2 fine young goats. I'll use them to prepare your father's favorite dish. Then take the food to your father so he can eat it and bless you before he dies.' But look," Jacob replied to Rebekah, "my brother Esau is a hairy man and my skin is smooth. What if my father touches me? He'll see that I'm trying to trick him, and then he'll curse me instead of blessing me." But his mother replied, "Then let the curse fall on me, my son. Just do what I tell you. Go out and get the goats for me." So Jacob went out and got the young goats for his mother. Rebekah took them and prepared a delicious meal, just the way Isaac liked. Then she took Esau's favorite clothes, which were there in the house, and gave them to her younger son Jacob. She covered his arms and the smooth part of his neck with the skin of the young goats. Then she gave Jacob the delicious meal, including freshly baked bread. So Jacob took the food to his father. "My father," he said. "Yes, my son," Isaac answered. "Who are you, Esau or Jacob?" Jacob replied, "It's Esau, your firstborn son. I've done as you told me. Here is the wild game. Now sit up and eat it so you can give me your blessing." Isaac asked, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" "The Lord, your God, put it in my path," Jacob replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Come close so I can touch you and make sure that you really are Esau." So Jacob went closer to his father, and Isaac touched him. "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's," Isaac said. but he did not recognize Jacob because Jacob's hands felt hairy just like Esau's. So Isaac prepared to bless Jacob. "But are you really my son Esau?" he asked. "Yes, I am," Jacob replied. Then Isaac said, "Now, my son, bring me the wild game. Let me eat it, and then I will give you my blessing." So Jacob took the food to his father, and Isaac ate it. He also drank the wine that Jacob served him. Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come a little closer and kiss me, my son." So Jacob went over and kissed him, and when Isaac caught the smell of his clothes, he was finally convinced, and he blessed his son.
When you heard that story of Jacob's big lie, did you catch how many times that Jacob and his mother Rebekah repeated lie after lie after lie and wrong after wrong after wrong in hopes of making things right? Or, well, maybe if not right, at least getting what they want, which is kind of how they're defining right here. And when they got what they wanted in the end, when they got Isaac's blessing for Jacob instead of for Esau, their strategy of doubling down on wrong seems to have been a good one, because it got them what they wanted. Well, was it really? Was it really a good strategy? Do the ends really justify the means? Let's dig into that. The story of Jacob and Esau starts in Genesis chapter 25. And Rebekah, Isaac's wife, is having twins, and it's causing some complications during the pregnancy, and so she asks God what's going on. I'm reading now from Genesis 25, verse 23. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." The older will serve the younger. That's not the way it worked in the world at the time, but that's what God says is going to happen. And the younger one here is Jacob, secondborn. Secondborn in a world where firstborn have all sorts of advantages. I mean, in this world, the firstborn son was going to eventually become leader of the family clan just because he was the firstborn son. And he was going to get at least a double portion of inheritance just because he was the firstborn son. And from Jacob's perspective, and from his mother's perspective, who liked Jacob more than she liked Esau, that wasn't right. I mean, in their eyes, performance should count just as much as birth order, don't you think? Maybe even more. I mean, that's the way it works in the 21st century. And so as the story unfolds, what we see happening is both Jacob and Rebekah leaning into that prophecy, the older's going to serve the younger, as sort of a justification for, well, call it helping God along. Even if it takes a little shady behavior on their part to make that happen. Because the ends justify the means, right? Well, perhaps in our eyes, but never in God's eyes. A wrong doesn't make a right. And doubling down on wrong doesn't make it any righter. It just makes it messier. Now, not much more is said about the early years, although I'm sure the sibling rivalry is pretty intense. I mean, especially since Jacob and Esau were very different, and mom and dad had obvious favorites. But that would just be reading between the lines. What's not reading between the lines is what we see at the end of chapter 25, when the boys are grown up, and Jacob has now an opportunity before him to sort of assist that older will serve the younger prophecy, even though it required him to do something that wasn't exactly the right thing to do in the situation. Now here's how that happened. Esau comes in famished from a long day of hunting. And Jacob the schemer is going to take advantage of that to get what he wants. Perhaps again he's even reminding himself of that God story that mom's been telling him all his life, how you're going to be the one in charge in the end. And that maybe is what he used to justify what he's going to do. Nothing wrong with helping God along, right? I mean, just taking matters into my own hands and seizing the day when the day is there to be seized. God said it would happen, right? So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is this. Jacob never stopped to ask, is what I'm thinking of doing actually the right thing? Actually the right thing, the brotherly thing, the godlike thing. What would have been the right thing to do here? Well, the right thing to do would have been to give his brother something to eat, period. No strings or conditions. I mean, Jacob had the food. His brother had a need, so feed him, right? In New Testament terms, that's what Jesus would do. But for Jacob here, it's not quite so simple. Because Jacob senses an opportunity. And he knows his brother well, and he knows his brother Esau lives for the moment, and he doesn't think too far ahead, and he doesn't think about the long-term consequences. He just acts. And right now, well, Esau is just hungry. He's really hungry. And while Esau's not going to die if he doesn't eat right then, Esau wants to eat right then. And he's smelling food, and he feels he needs to eat right then, and forget about waiting to get home, forget about fixing his own dinner. He's tired, he's hungry, and he wants what he wants now, not later, no matter what the cost, not even thinking about any future consequences. And Jacob knows that. He knows Esau's tendencies, and he uses that to his advantage. Now check out this exchange. Genesis 25, I'm starting at verse 29. One day, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau arrived from home from the wilderness, exhausted and hungry. Esau said to Jacob, I'm starved. Give me some of that red stew. This is how Esau got his other name, Edom, which means red. All right, Jacob replied, but trade me your rights as the firstborn son. Look, I'm dying of starvation, said Esau. What good is my birthright to me now? But Jacob said, first you must swear that your birthright is mine. So Esau swore an oath, thereby selling all his rights as the firstborn to his brother Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and lentil stew. Esau ate the meal, then got up and left. He showed contempt for his rights as the firstborn. Now, as far as right, there is not a lot of right going on anywhere here. Esau's not right. Esau traded his birthright for a bowl of soup, and that's not right. But neither is Jacob. Jacob took advantage of his brother, and that's not right either. I mean, right is doing what's kind and what's loving and what God would say to do in the situation. And taking advantage of someone, that doesn't check any of those boxes. But Jacob wanted what he wanted, and, there don't seem to be a lot of consequences that happen here. And so Jacob is starting to internalize that doubling down on wrong works, that the ends justify the means. It's starting to become a part of the way that he operates with people because it seems to work. And so for Jacob, he's going to keep on having the ends justify the means, even if it means doing something shady. Now, before we move on in the conversation, I want you to think about how you've seen that in our world this day. Just hit pause in a moment and think about this. Where do you see that the ends justifies the means philosophy kind of working its way into our world? And what are some of the results of that sort of thinking becoming normal? Go ahead and talk about that right now. Interesting how that ends justifies the means philosophy has kind of made its way into our world and into our lives. Jacob had that all over his life. It became part of how he normally operated with people because, again, it seemed to work. Yeah, it was messy a little bit, but it seems to get him what he wants. So he's going to keep doubling down on wrong, even if it means doing something shady, because he wants what he wants, what he wants. And he's not going to let anything get in the way of that. Certainly not a simple thing like right. Which brings us back to what we read in the beginning, Genesis chapter 27. Jacob's now a full-grown adult, at least 40, probably a lot older than that. So he should have developed some maturity by this point, and he should have certainly developed a better understanding of what right is and what the right thing to do is, but apparently not. I mean, his father Isaac is old and near death. And as Jacob sees that, he starts figuring, well, now is the time to claim this birthright that I got in a kind of sneaky way, but hey, it's mine now, so it's mine and I'm going to get it. But here's the problem, there's no proof of that. There's no proof that Esau traded his birthright for a bowl of soup. There were no cell phone videos, no wires, no lawyers present, not even a hastily scrambled note by Esau. And Dad's not going to change convention or tradition just on the word of Jacob because he likes Esau better, right? So once again, Jacob's, to get what he wants, is going to double down on wrong and convinces himself that doubling down on wrong is actually the right thing to do. And this time, he's actually got an accomplice. Mom overhears Isaac telling Esau to go out and shoot some game and prepare me a special meal for this blessing ceremony that I'm going to give you. And as she overhears that, Rebekah very quickly and on the spot, she comes up with this plan for Jacob to step in and to trick his father into thinking that he's Esau so that the blessing that they both feel Jacob rightly deserves, that he's going to get it instead of Esau. Now, the whole tricking him thing should have been one of those gut-level warnings I've been talking about, that what they're doing is not quite right, and it's kind of messy. But they want what they want, and so nothing's going to stop them. I mean, make a meal just like Isaac likes it, which probably means like Esau cooks it because Esau was Isaac's favorite. Check. Get me a goat, Rebekah says, and I'll fix it just the right way. Second thoughts that, hey, we might not be able to pull that off. Well, Rebekah takes care of that one. Jacob, if we're caught, I'll take all the blame. Check. Impersonate Esau? Well, Isaac's almost blind. So, borrow some of Esau's clothes so you smell like Esau. You get some of those goat skins and put them all over your arms and the rest of your body so you feel hairy like Esau. When Dad asks you, are you Esau? Say, yes, I'm Esau. Maybe even get really emotional about it. Check, check, check. Question. Is deception a quality of God or of the devil? And whose side does that mean that Rebekah and Jacob are coming down on? And isn't that the side that we're coming down on whenever we practice deception too? Is it ever right to do what's wrong? Not in God's eyes. But to cement this deception, Jacob actually even brings God into it. Isaac wonders how he got there so quickly, how he got out the game so quickly for this stew that he likes. And listen to what Jacob says. Chapter 27, verse 20. Isaac asked, how did you find it so quickly, my son? The Lord, your God, put it in my path, Jacob replied. Your God provided. One more lie, doubling down on wrong, even bigger, bringing God into that. And so Jacob was deceived. Isaac was deceived. And Jacob ended up getting his father's blessing. And so it almost again looks as if doubling down on wrong has actually worked. That the ends actually do justify the means. But what were the results actually? Yes, Jacob got the blessing, but he didn't get to enjoy it. Esau's reaction to this, getting shafted, he vows to get revenge. And revenge in his eyes means, I'm going to murder my brother. And so Jacob ends up becoming a fugitive who can't go home. And Mom, who helped him get what he wanted, never sees her favorite son again. Conclusion? This seems messed up. Really messed up. And it is. And it's also the logical and natural result of that me first kind of thinking that's so ingrained in us. Doubling down on wrong actually didn't make things right, it only made them worse. And the sooner we learn that, the better, don't you think? Now here's some things that you can build into your life to help you with that. It's nothing new. You've probably heard me say it before. You've probably heard it in other places before. People in my small group brought that up this last week during our discussion. But while these things aren't new, they work. They actually work, and they help us recognize wrong so that we don't double down on it and create an even bigger mess. So here they are. Number one, know what God says is right. In other words, know some basic Bible. Number two, ask God to help you do the right thing. Actually spend some time praying for discernment and for wisdom and for the ability both not only to know the right thing but also to do the right thing as God defines right. And number three, hang out with other people who are also committed to doing what's right, that are going to help you in that, who are going to ask the sort of questions you need to honestly evaluate what you're doing or what you're thinking of doing. Now, building those things into your life doesn't guarantee that you won't find yourself sometimes doubling down on wrong anyway, but because our self-centered and self-serving nature is still such a part of us. But making those three things, knowing Bible, knowing what God says, and praying for discernment to do what's right, and hanging out with others who also have a commitment to do what's right, doing those things and making them a regular and consistent part of your life is going to give you a better shot at going too far down that road of doubling down on wrong. And remember this too as you're thinking about that. There's going to come a time that you do it anyway. When you do and you mess up, remember that God has also provided a solution for the messes. That He deals with the things that we can't clean up. We've seen it in the story of Adam and Eve, and in Noah, and in Abraham, and we're going to see it as we get next week further into the story of Jacob. Maybe like me, you've experienced it in your own life too. Experienced a time when you messed up, and then you just admit to God that I've blown it. And you hear God say, well, that's why I sent Jesus, because you blew it. I sent Jesus to forgive your sin and to help you start fresh. Now that's really important to remember. But perhaps there's maybe still one more question eating at you in this story. I know it's bothered me for a while, and that's this. Well, why Jacob at all? Why Jacob at all? I mean, God sees Jacob's character flaws, right? So why does He let Jacob be the one that the promise is passed on to? It just doesn't seem, well, right. But watch this and see what you think.
Think God can't use you? Think He only uses perfectly qualified people? Take a closer look. Moses was not a great speaker. Jonah ran from God. Jacob was a liar. Noah got drunk. Rahab was a prostitute. David had an affair. Jeremiah was depressed, a lot. Solomon was rich in wisdom but poor in lifestyle. John the Baptist was just plain poor. Timothy was too young. Abraham was too old. Lazarus was dead. Sarah was barren. Naomi was a widow. Gideon and Thomas both doubted, and so did Sarah. Peter lacked self-control. James and John were self-righteous. Paul had a short fuse. Well, so did Peter and Moses. Actually, lots of people did. God's army isn't perfect. It never has been. It's the march of the unqualified. Get in line.
Kind of seems to me as if God is constantly choosing the unqualified. And perhaps he does that to help us see something about him. I mean, take Jacob. What kind of material is Jacob to work with? And how deserving is Jacob to be the one to carry on the promise? Not very. Jacob's a schemer, and he's a deceiver. Those aren't really values that God holds up and says, do this. And even as you follow Jacob's life past this point, you see, he doesn't really get a whole lot better. Yeah, he learns some things about God along the way, but he still ends up being a lousy parent whose dysfunction carries on through his family for generations and generations. And his doubling down on wrong messed up his life and the lives of all those closest to him. And yet, the promise still goes from Abraham to Isaac and then through Jacob. I mean, what gives with that? Jacob didn't deserve it, and yet God chose Jacob to have a part in carrying the promise forward. And maybe, just maybe, that's getting an important truth that God wants us to understand. That neither our faults, nor our lack of character, nor our doubling down on wrong, even though it's definitely not right, none of that's ever going to change God's character or cancel God's promises. See, God is always faithful, and God always keeps his word. And God's promises and rewards are always, always, always grace, not merit. And that's pretty important for those of us who aren't so strong and who don't have it all together and who might even be described as difficult or unpromising material to work with. That's important for us to hear. It's important for us to hear that God doesn't love just those almost perfect people. God loves people, period. So here's what I think God wants you to get in this part of the story. He wants you to get that God's promises aren't determined by our performance. Let me say that again. God's promises aren't determined by our performance. Yes, God wants us to perform, all right? And he wants us to perform well. But God's promises aren't based on our performance. God's promises are based on grace. They're always based on grace. God doesn't invite us to be part of the promise because we did anything special. God doesn't invite us to be part of the promise because he sees something special in us. God invites us to be part of the promise because of what Jesus did. God invites us to be part of the promise because he loves us, period. Which is, again, grace. God's promises aren't determined by our performance. And to me, that's a really, really good thing. You see, there are times like Jacob that I've been unfaithful. There are times like Jacob that I've twisted words and situations to benefit me, even though it wasn't the right thing to do. There are times like Jacob I've convinced myself that doubling down on wrong was right when it really wasn't. There are times that I've thought of myself before everyone else, even those closest to me. There are times that I didn't do the right thing when I easily could have. There are times like Jacob that I made a mess of relationships. There are times that I've made the same mistake over and over and over again. There are times that I've embraced values and actions that aren't of God and even come up with some sort of twisted justification like the ends justify the means as to why what I'm doing is okay. That's a lot of our stories, isn't it? Some of the time. But this part of Jacob's story tells us this, that even though we've been at times undeserving and unqualified, that we have never, ever been unloved. We have never, ever been unloved, and we've never, ever been excluded from the invitation to be part of God's plans and God's promises, even if we find ourselves acting like Jacob. Even when we're like that, God's promises are still true. God's promises are still true, and God's grace still remains, and Jesus' love for us never fails. Even though we're unqualified, God chooses us anyway. Chooses us to shower us with His grace. And chooses to bless us with His love, even though we really don't deserve it. Here's some of that Bible I told you to keep learning that helps you remember that. Isaiah chapter 43, verse 1. Fear not, God says, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You're mine. God says it. God means it. His promises aren't determined by our performance. His promises are always grace.